Hi everyone, this is Pat the Serial Gamer, and today it's finally time to be done with these dusty old NES RPGs. So let's have a look at what Sakaguchi and his pals did with Final Fantasy III. The original, not this one. So let's start with the formalities. If you're wondering why I'm not talking about one of the best RPGs of all time in these videos, it's because that's Final Fantasy VI. We'll get there eventually, and no, I just can't wait either. This Final Fantasy III came out on April 27th, 1990, only in Japan, and I'll just remind you, by the way, that the first one came out a few weeks later in May in North America. So Hironobu Sakaguchi is often named the series creator, but of course he wasn't alone. For Final Fantasy II, he basically left the project in the hands of Akitoshi Kawazu for some quite experimental results. After that, Kawazu's gonna have some fun with his very hit-or-miss Saga series. For Final Fantasy III, the theme was more like, let's put all of our ideas in a bucket and try to make as many as we can fit with Sakaguchi's story. So, what is Final Fantasy III's story? The Gorgon's prophecy says that the darkness will take over the world by stealing the light of the 4 crystals of the element, but 4 fated warriors will come to the rescue to save the world. While we're on topic, that's not the only thing borrowed from Final Fantasy I. Pretty early, we need to save a Princess Sarah. The Gorgons I mentioned earlier stand in a circle formation and spout a lot of exposition on the world you're in. Even the levels and the same magic point system from the first game make a return, but better. As for the rest, however, it is quite different and a lot more lighthearted than the first 2 games. In fact, I would say this is one of the most laid-back games in the series. So in that game you control 4 nameless orphans who can always dual wield any weapon. Well, except for bows, cause that would be weird. They fall into a goblin infested cave with a nice mysterious music that sounds as if it was played with an old telephone. Their armor makes them look like a bunch of onions, and that's actually why they're called the Onion Knights. No, Davos has nothing to do with it. At the end of the cave, they save the Wind Crystal, who asks them to protect the other 3 crystals of light from the wandering darkness. And to help our heroes, it bestows upon them the power to change almost at will into 5 other classes: Warrior, Monk, White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage. Almost the same as Final Fantasy I actually. You get the Thief a little while later with another bunch of jobs we'll get for the first time. The adventure sends us here and there to solve various problems in the many towns you'll come across. And if there's one thing that Final Fantasy III succeeds with flying colors, it's on the sides of adventure, exploration, and pacing. First thing, generally speaking, you shouldn't need to just stop on your tracks to grind EXP too many times in this game. And also, just in the first area of the games, you get 2 towns, a castle, and a few caves to explore. After you solve the problem of Kazis' invisible population, there's this man named Sid, no relation to Sid from Final Fantasy II, who gives you right away the possibility of exploring the whole world with an airship and... whoops. Well, at least you can explore a bit further, but later... What's with that game with airships? Don't worry, you get a few airships in this game. But I digress. Your objective in this game is pretty much explore the world or find a way to do it with all the adventuring that entails. For example, after you bring back our dear old Sid home, you hear about some dude stuck in a nearby mountain. You go there, and once you reach the top, you meet a man named Desh. But hey, if it isn't Bahamut coming back from his Final Fantasy II vacations. He wants to eat you, so that's how you learn to run away from battle. And that's pretty much how the game works. You get in a situation and you have to learn how a spell or a job class works. After you run away from the Dragon God, you learn in the nearby woods that there's this town with very small people in the forest. And that's when you learn the mini spell to shrink your whole team to find it. That's also one of these times that you want a mage team. Just saying. After 2 or 3 hours and beating up a small rat in mini mode, You get a ship and you can already explore a good chunk of map as you wish. There are even a few towns you never have to visit, but that are worth checking out. Even the towns themselves have a few secret passages in houses and in woods. And even one of them has a few random encounters to get to a hidden chest. There's a point in your submarine, yes, you get a submarine, in which you can find a cave which will lead you to another town if you're curious, or simply a cave with a lot of weapons in it. Again, from what I know, you never need to go there. Something caught your eye? Well, there's a cave to explore. And the dungeons are not endless labyrinths as in Final Fantasy II. 3 or 4 floors of hallways and hidden passages, and none of these annoying doors. When you start feeling like it kinda gets drawn out, well, that's when it ends. Boom, next. Personally, I tend to prefer having many short dungeons than long labyrinths that overstay their welcome, especially when there are no save points in it. And to make your exploration easier, there's an element from Final Fantasy II that makes its grand return, the Chocobos. They run as fast as the wind, ignoring random encounters, and you have a lot more chances in seeing them in this game, as they have many hidden forests everywhere. And Uematsu finally finished writing their team. But they also brought along their cousin, the Fat Chocobo, who's there to keep your reserve items. Because with so much limited space, about 20 jobs and a lot of exclusive equipment, what a better way than a big birdie's fat stomach to hide your items. When you want your old sword or axe back, he'll just puke it out like a cat does a fur ball. Just don't forget to wipe it clean afterwards. Ew. While we're on the series mascots, at one point you need to meet the old great Magus Doga. And his assistants are these white little furballs with a red pom-pom. The Moogles. Hey, can be an old man and like cute little critters too, you know. I mentioned music earlier, but Uematsu really mastered the limits of the NES, as he wrote a soundtrack that is about as big as those in Final Fantasies 1 and 2 combined. Many towns and dungeons do have their own themes. In towns, there are dancers that will start dancing for you because they have nothing else to do, and they will use one more music from the Swan Lake. Or even these 4 random old idiots you will come across 2 or 3 times, and they have their own theme. The boss fight theme is quite great, and the final boss theme is one of the best things you can hear on the NES. On the fighting side of things, there's one big thing that changed, and it's that finally, attackers can change their targets when the monsters they were going to attack dies. Strangely, not for magic though. And that brings me to talk about the 21 jobs. Now, I understand that some people might have splattered their coffee all over their screen when I mentioned 21 jobs in an NES RPG. But I'm just gonna snap you back to reality, okay? There is variety, but sometimes it just might be there for the sake of it. For example, in addition to the warrior who can, well, attack, there's a knight who can protect his allies if they're getting low on HP. The dragoon can jump for a turn while leaving his allies defenseless for a turn that you have to use for a boss. The thief can steal at long last, but mostly potions. There's nothing really worth stealing in this game. The bard can cause real disasters with his music just like Justin Bieber or make your attackers stronger. In addition to classic black and white magic, the Geomancer can use the power of the elements free of charge to annihilate his enemies, when it doesn't blow up right in his face. The Invoker can summon the Icy Shiva, the Infernal Ifrit, or a Chocobo, why not? They will either attack an enemy, heal you, or help you run away. It's random actually. There are also jobs that are only used once or twice, like the Scholar, who can not only smack people in the face with a dictionary, but can also detect monster weaknesses, which is really useful a grand total of once, for a boss who can change its weakness. The Magic Knight can use his katana to prevent monsters from splitting up when you hit them, in 1 or 2 dungeons. Okay. Some of them are only enhancements. The Black Belt is basically a monk who can charge his attack for more damage. The Magus and the Devouts are just black and white mages with way more magic points, and you get them in the final dungeon's doorstep. And the Summoners are invokers who can tap into the full power of their monsters. Ifrit can burn enemies with hellfire. Odin, the first one that was created actually, can slice them up with his Antetsuken. Leviathan can drown everyone with a tidal wave, and Bahamut can destroy everything with his Mega Flare. Actually, those last three won't give their powers for free, as you have to find them and prove yourself worthy. Your team also evolves with good old experience points, and it will be the case relatively for the rest of the franchise. Your characters are also pretty much 4 blank slates. What I mean is that they don't really have an affinity for a job. Saying that you have a level 15 knight is more meaningful than saying that Lunette himself is level 15. Also, in the NES version, every time you want to change jobs, you need to strip that character naked, change a job, and re-equip that character all over again, ideally with all the equipment you need. Also, it costs CP, while in the 3D version, your stats go down for a few fights to give them time to adjust to it. Add to that the fact that they highly suggest you use such jobs, and you don't really have a whole lot of motivation to experiment actually. I really had to push myself to change jobs just to try them out once in a while. Well, if it wasn't for that video, maybe I wouldn't have noticed that the bard is actually not that bad in this game. So really, all things considered, you can say that Final Fantasy III is really the first one to have all the elements that makes what you could call the classic Final Fantasy. Of course, the first one puts the foundation together, and Final Fantasy II was a weird experiment that did find a few things despite what it is, but it's in Final Fantasy III that everything comes together. You even get many airships, 2 whole world maps to explore with a transition in which the sight spell actually has some use. The one element that's missing despite scenes that flow together pretty well, it's a good story with memorable characters, cause on the emotional level, that's pretty much what it is. Oh no, Aria, you can't die, we spent 2 whole scenes together. No. Despite that, there's a pretty nice lore to discover that's about the struggles between light and the forces of darkness. And the big bag Xande, who has very good reasons to be angry when you think about it. And of course you get the true final boss that almost comes out of nowhere. That can be considered a big bag of evil with a capital E. Which brings me to talk about the endgame without spoiling anything. Oh boy. Cause at the end of the marathon, just before the finish line, Final Fantasy III stumbles in its shoelaces and falls flat on its face, and breaks its nose and a leg, and gets rolled over by a car. Because every single prose I gave this game in the last few minutes with the pacing, the fun to explore, and the small bit of job variety, it all goes up in smoke in the last dungeon. Keep in mind that the Invincible, your massive flying fortress that's also a portable inn, is stuck behind a labyrinth that takes about 10 minutes to speed through, and that in these specific dungeons, the teleportation spell that is used to immediately leave a dungeon doesn't work, so you need to do everything on foot. The Crystal Tower is also the entrance to Eureka, a mystic cave with lots of legendary weapons and the 2 last jobs, the Ninja and the Sage, that are basically the 2 jobs that count from now on. They are way stronger than the rest, and they're the only ones to have a chance against the final boss. Forget the Geomancer or the Viking against the final boss. The Ninja can equip any weapon with more efficiency, and the Sage can use any spell and has more stats overall than the other mages. And that's when you start the final dungeon. The Crystal Tower by itself takes a good 20 to 30 minutes to go through in a straight line. Also add to that a likely first run to clean all the chests. And before you get to the very top, I really hope you grinded a good 10 levels at least before moving on. The Cave of Bahamut is a great grinding spot, by the way. So, okay, you went back to the ship to heal, cursing all the gods in existence because, hey, guess what? The game has no tent. You waltzed around again in the labyrinth a good 10 minutes, climbed that tower a good 20 to 30 minutes, and on top you fight the first boss. And then, you can't get out. You need to walk through a whole other dungeon of about an hour with 4 more bosses that could tear your face off with one bite, and maybe cause a glitch that will give you 99 Kaiser Knuckles. What? And now you get to the final boss. You must have lots of resources and elixirs to heal up and all that, no problem, but you didn't save, you know? You didn't save your game. Last save was about an hour and a half ago. No, I didn't use emulation save states here. So, you'd better win. So, despite the slap in the face that's the final dungeon, Final Fantasy III is the most polished Final Fantasy on the NES. It's a bit more linear than Final Fantasy I, but you still have some freedom to explore. It's also one of the most laid back in the franchise. When you get into towns, the world is not literally rotting, and there's no emperor terrorizing the world. Things do go wrong, but usually people are just chilling out, which gives an almost Dragon Quest vibe in some places. Although it is a pretty hard game, it is more consistent than Final Fantasy II. So, generally speaking, I would say that it is my favorite of the first trilogy, but it's still far from being among the best in my opinion. Final Fantasy III gets some basics right. There's a story that keeps you going, and the job system is interesting, but oh, it gets much better afterwards. As I said at the beginning, the version you just saw stayed in Japan, but they did want to localize it in America for a while. Later on, at the start of the 2000s, Square released ports of the first 2 games on the WonderSwan color, a small 16-bit portable console exclusive to Japan, which gives us the basics for the remakes we saw later. But Final Fantasy III's remake was cancelled. That is why in 2006 a 3D remake came out on the DS. That version has a little bit more story, especially at the start with characters that have a bit more personality. Battles are usually against 2 or 3 monsters instead of 8 in the original, but it is balanced as such. Bosses are harder because they can act twice per turn and can easily destroy you if you're not careful. Many classes have one more ability added to better differentiate them, like the Magic or Dark Knight to use a really strong attack, and the Hunter can use 4 weaker attacks per turn. Job levels are also gained faster. There are some online elements that were added that are now impossible to get because there are no more internet on the DS. So if you want to try this version out, go with the PSP or the Steam version, as these online elements have been changed to be gained the good old way, by looking out for them. Both versions did leave a great heritage, however. The project leads on the NES version will get to work on the Mana series, Chrono Cross, Final Fantasy XIV 1.2, Xenogears. As for the 3D version, the team will eventually move on with classic style RPGs with the Bravely series and Octopath Traveler that I recommend if you think Final Fantasy has too much action nowadays. What's ironic is that Final Fantasy III is the last classic Final Fantasy title to be released in America, but it was actually partially developed in the US, as the working visa for the main programmer, Nasir Gabelli, had just been expired. The team followed him in the States to finish up the game. If you like that kind of small details and others I sprinkled out throughout the videos, I have put 2 links in the descriptions of 2 recent interviews with Hiromichi Tanaka and Koichi Ichi who worked on the game that are really worth the read. So that's it for today, guys. Question of the day though, what was your worst final dungeon in a video game? And in the next episode, Lara Croft gets a butter knife. Subscribe to not miss it, and I'll see you guys then.